story. The building on 7th Street where Barton lived and worked had been really forgotten to history, and in the end is saved through probably one of the most serendipitous preservation stories you'll ever hear. And thankfully it was saved for posterity, turned into a museum, restored back to its 19th century appearance. So we'll be talking about that in addition to talking about Clara Barton's career. Talk a little bit about the institution I work for. I do work for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine, which is in Frederick, Maryland. That museum has 3 locations: the National Museum of Civil War Medicine in Frederick, Maryland, the Pratt Field Hospital Museum at Antietam National Battlefield, and then our most recent site, which is the one that I work at, is the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum. We are a member-supported nonprofit. I've been getting used to doing this. We've been doing a lot of virtual programming over the last 2 months. 3 times a week, we're going live on Facebook Live, many times using Zoom like this. And so this is always where I throw out the pitch. So if you are really interested in this story, interested in the medical aspects of the war, I'm going to drop a membership link into the chat right now. So if you're interested in the story and want to support the museum, even though we're not open to the public, allow us to continue doing what we do moving forward into the future, consider clicking on that link in the chat, becoming a member of the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. I know y'all are part of these wonderful groups that are all here this evening. Thank you for supporting Civil War history. It's a really important topic to talk about and to ensure that we continue talking about in the future. But if you're looking for another place to put $25 and support history, I hope you'll consider giving it to the National Museum of Civil War Medicine and Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum. This is all taking a lot of getting used to, so I apologize if there's any hiccups this evening. I think you can all understand. Still getting the hang of doing these virtual programs. It's so interesting to not see, an audience of people out in front of me, but 4 separate boxes all over the place. And I think, 70, 80 people on here. Thank you all so much for being here this evening. I hope you enjoy this presentation. So I'm going to bounce over
89 people, but don't worry about that.
Yeah, I'm going to bounce over to my PowerPoint now. So if you'll bear with me. All right, almost there. And there we go. All right, can everybody see that? Good, excellent. So this is our logo for the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. This sign that you see at the center of your screen is going to play a really important role in both the Missing Soldiers Office. This is a sign that was on 7th Street outside of the Missing Soldiers Office itself, letting people, visitors, those who had appointments with Clara Barton to know where the site was. But this sign also plays a role in the preservation story as well. And we're going to get into that here in just a bit. A little bit of background information about Clara Barton. So who Clara Barton was. So she is born in North Oxford, Massachusetts in 1821. She's born on Christmas Day of 1821 to a fairly prosperous family in Massachusetts. North Oxford is a ways west of Boston. It's closer to Worcester, Massachusetts. So she oftentimes is identified as coming from Worcester, though her hometown was North Oxford. She is going to grow up in a decent-sized family. She has older brothers that she really looks up to, but she's a really independent child. She does not really like being around other people. She's much more comfortable with animals. She's pretty shy. When she is a fairly young girl, an older brother falls off the roof of the family barn and was severely injured. She nursed him back to health. That is going to be her only significant nursing experience before the outbreak of the Civil War. We often think of Clara Barton as one of these, icons of early nursing care during the Civil War, but she's like many of those other nurses that are going to come to renown. She has very little nursing experience before the conflict actually breaks out. She was a very good student, very intelligent, and did well in school. And so when she's coming of age, she doesn't have many marriage prospects. Again, she doesn't really like other people. And so she really has, as a middle-class young woman, she really doesn't have many options in terms of a career. One of the options that is available to her in early 19th century New England is as a school teacher. And Massachusetts had a very progressive public education system for the time. And so there's this belief that in order to have an informed republic, you need to have informed voters. Of course, those are all men in the early 19th century and will be all men for the length of Clara Barton's life. But she's going to find a place in the schoolroom. It's going to become a well-renowned teacher in Massachusetts and then in other states, as I'll get to in just a second. So she transitions from student to educator, and that transition goes pretty well. She is shy, she has to overcome that, but once she becomes comfortable in that educator role, she becomes just a fine teacher. But one of the things that she always faces when she is an educator is inequality. And this is something that is going to gall Clara Barton throughout her life until after the Civil War, when she kind of becomes an icon in the humanitarian field. But Clara Barton never receives the same amount of pay as her male counterparts in the education field. And this really troubles her. So much so we have this we have a quote, this quote on a mug that we sell at the museum, but she says that to a school board in the 1840s in Massachusetts that I may sometimes work for free, but I will never do a man's work for less than a man's pay. So Clara Barton, advocate for equal pay right there in the 1840s. She does not find that equality in the classroom in Massachusetts. She does pursue graduate studies in New York at the end of the 1840s and early 1850s, and meets a friend there that is going to bring her to New Jersey in the early 1850s. And she'll actually help to open up one of the first public schools in a small town in New Jersey. And she's going to run that schoolroom, starts with 6 students. By the end of her first year there, her only year there, she had several hundred students. So she had this, connection with her students that she was able to really be a fine educator. She also had this reputation as being a very loving teacher, a very caring teacher, but she could also be a firm, scary authoritarian if she needed to be. So there's this balance in Clara Barton that is this tenderness, and she can be soft, but she can also be hard and hard driving, and you didn't want to cross paths with her in terms of if you were in her way, she's going to knock you out of the way. And this is going to be something that is going to be very helpful for her later in life. At the end of her time in New Jersey, she is replaced. She gets sick at the end of the school term. She comes back and had been replaced by a male superintendent of the school in New Jersey. This is the school here that she taught at. Is still preserved today, a one-room schoolhouse. When I say she had hundreds of students, that is not all at once, clearly. They're not all piling into this school, but the way that it worked is that they would come in and out of the school all during the day and at night. So this part of New Jersey, which New Jersey didn't have that public education ethos that Massachusetts did in the early 19th century. Clara Barton really introduced it to some parts of New Jersey. She also had adult students coming in for night school to learn, to read and write, the very basics that they never had an opportunity to learn. So Clara Barton gets really upset, really angry when she's replaced by this male superintendent. So she leaves public education forever, and she is going to find a new role. And she has family members who kind of extended family members that live in Washington. And so she is going to move to Washington in the early 1850s, and she is going to go work here. That is the United States Patent Office. So Clara Barton is going to become one of the first women to work for the federal government. And she is going to work at the United States Patent Office. She's going to work there as a clerk. What is remarkable about her time at the Patent Office is that she is able to get equal pay. She's being paid the same amount as her male counterparts. She is working in the same office with them, in the same space. This is incredibly progressive for America at the time. let alone that this is happening in Washington, which is a notoriously conservative place in the 19th century, remarked as a southern city. It's not a particularly pleasant place to be in the years before the Civil War. Really an unfinished city, as I'm sure all of you are very familiar with some of these stories. This is how Clara Barton first is exposed to the city. She's going to live in boarding houses through the 1850s. Again, she does have family connections in the city who are already living here. She's going to kind of tap into those family networks, although she is also going to become connected with some of the politicos as well. One of the more influential she's going to make connections with, it's going to be very important during her Civil War experience, is Henry Wilson, who's going to be one of the most powerful senators on the Hill during the Civil War. And so she is already starting to create this network that is going to prove very helpful for her a decade later. So she's going to start at the patent office in the mid-1850s. She's going to work there for a couple of years. She enjoys her work. I think really enjoyed having access to all of the science and technology that is coming through the patent office at this time. Think of this, this is the time of the telegraph, new inventions are coming out every day. This is a really important place to work. This is where all of that knowledge is kind of being compiled, categorized, and understood, and she has her hands on all of that. So there's a science and technology aspect of Clara Barton's experience, the patent office. But the workplace for her was really difficult, understandably so. She is a woman entering into a man's world, and that is going to come with a lot of harassment, be that sexual harassment, be that virtually any kind of harassment you can imagine. So life and work was not particularly easy for Barton. But I think that for her, there was this certain status that she had as one of these few women who are doing this work in a man's world that she found really riveting, and she found impressive that she was able to do this. This gives her some status as a single woman. She is never going to marry in her lifetime. She has a few relationships kind of earlier on in her life. They don't turn out the way she would have liked. So by this time, she is basically set into her ways that she is going to live as a single woman, and that was really difficult for her. This opportunity meant a lot to her. However, that opportunity is short-lived because in 1857, or 1856, I should say, to preface this, 1856, James Buchanan is elected president of the United States. This is always the part where I give presentations where I apologize to everyone in the audience. As a native Pennsylvanian, I apologize for giving the United States James Buchanan, our only president from Pennsylvania. I am wearing a Phillies hat. I miss baseball very much. Also, I have terrible hair right now, so I'm trying to cover that up. I always apologize for James Buchanan, so sorry for Pennsylvania giving the nation James Buchanan. Buchanan is going to, when he's inaugurated in 1857, he is going to, of course, there's no public service protection for workers. And so oftentimes you're going to see people swept out as a new administration comes in. Buchanan comes in, he's conservative, very much tied in with Southern legislators, and they're going to sweep all of the women out of the patent office. Clara Barton holds on a bit longer than some of the other workers, but she is ultimately going to be out of a job in 1857, 1858. And so Barton is going to kind of go into this kind of wandering period. She's going to stay with family. She's going to travel around. She doesn't really have a set lifestyle. She doesn't have a job, a consistent work. But this is all going to change for her in 1860 with the election of Abraham Lincoln and ultimately the outbreak of the Civil War. Clara Barton is going to have some new opportunities. So this is Barton, as you're going to see her in the 1860s. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this image. What I always like to point out about Barton's kind of wartime appearance is that she was very guarded about it. Barton had her photo taken a number of times. What we do know about some of those photos is that the plates were destroyed. Barton didn't like the way they turned out. She would destroy the plates. And so there are relatively few images of Barton. You saw one way back of her as a school teacher, as a younger woman. This is taken in, I believe, 1865. So Clara Barton is in her mid-40s when this photo is taken. But she's 39 when the Civil War War is going to break out. So this is Clara Barton as she experiences the Civil War. This is what she looks like. This is who she is. So Barton, after the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 and his inauguration in 1861, Clara Barton does go back to Washington full-time. She is going to pursue getting her job back at the United States Patent Office. Because of this new administration coming in, she believes that she supports Republicans. She is a New Englander. She wouldn't call herself an abolitionist until 1863, but she is anti-slavery. She doesn't believe in slavery, but she was fired in part for being a, quote, Black Republican. And so when a, quote, Black Republican is elected in 1860, she feels pretty confident that she's going to be able to get her job back at the Patent Office. In the spring of 1861, after Lincoln's inauguration, she's living at a boarding house in DC, not the boarding house where she's going to live for the majority of the war. But she is making efforts to get her job back. Those efforts are ultimately successful, but she doesn't get the same clerkship that she had back in the 1850s. Instead, she's going to be hired as a copyist, what I imagine to be the most boring job imaginable, copying patent documents by hand over and over again all day long. Pretty miserable work. So she gets that job, pays less than what she was making before, but nevertheless, she has a job back at the Patent Office with some of her old comrades there, including a gentleman named Edward Shaw. And Edward Shaw is going to play a role a little bit later in this story as the landlord of the boarding house that she is going to move into in the summer of 1861. But Clara Barton's going to get involved in this Civil War that's going on in America about a month after Abraham Lincoln's inauguration. Bombardment of Fort Sumter on April 12th and 13th, 1861. Barton is in the city of Washington, which was a chaotic place with no real, large numbers of soldiers. There's very little to defend the city. There's plots and fears of secessionists capturing the city of Washington. Barton is there and experiences all of that. But the moment that is really going to galvanize Clara Barton to go out onto the battlefield is going to take place on the streets of Baltimore on April 19th, 1861. Barton is keeping apprised of the news of what's going on in the city. And after Fort Sumter and after Lincoln calls for 75,000 recruits, many of those recruits are destined to head to Washington to defend the city. And on their way there, on April 18th, 1861, this is another shout out to my Pennsylvanians, some Pennsylvania soldiers from my neck of the woods in Pennsylvania, good old Schuylkill County, are going to get attacked on the way through Baltimore. No one, thankfully, was killed that day, but the next day, on April 19th, 1861, a regiment of Massachusetts soldiers passing through Baltimore, changing trains along Pratt Street when a mob was aroused. Someone fired a shot. Soldiers shoot into the crowd shoots back, and in the end, about 15 people are killed and dozens more are wounded, including 3 U.S. Soldiers. 3 Massachusetts soldiers are killed in the affair, which is going to become known as the Pratt Street Riot. Why this is important to Barton is that when these soldiers are passing through the city of Baltimore, there goes out an alarm, and ultimately the telegraph is going to tell Washington ahead of the soldiers arriving that Massachusetts soldiers were attacked on their way to get to Washington. And so this is going to lead hundreds of citizens to go out to the one of the railway stations into the city, and they're going to be there when this train arrives with wounded and kind of beaten soldiers. They start to detrain, and Barton is there. She recognizes these men as they're getting off the train. This unit was the 6th Massachusetts Militia. Some of those troops came from Barton's hometown. She recognized them. In some cases, she had been their teacher. And so she felt compelled to do something about it, to help those men. And so she's going to gather supplies for them. She's going to go around to shops around DC. She's going to be asking people for donations, anything that they could give to soldiers, food, clothing. She's going to give those goods that she was able to collect to the 6th Massachusetts as they were encamped. Their first night in the city was in the United States Senate chamber. So Clara Barton later remarked about going to visit those soldiers there, kind of holding court with them in the Senate chamber. But just the fact that she had to gather supplies for those men, that there was no barracks for those men, that they're encamped in the Senate chamber, tells you what the conditions were like at the outset of the war. The federal government is utterly unprepared for the conflict. And so it's going to take volunteers like Barton. She's going to become a relief worker. That's really what her career is, her humanitarian career starting out, is not as a nurse, but as a relief worker, gathering supplies and distributing them to soldiers. And she's going to be joined by many thousands of Northerners in that effort, both in the city of Washington and in the Army camps around Washington, but really all over the North. She's going to be supported. Other organizations, Sanitary Commission, Christian Commission, state relief organizations, local ladies' aid societies. Barton is very firmly in that vein. What separates her, though, is that she is operating in Washington, and that means she is going to have very close access to the soldiers in the field. She's going to be very close to the Army camps out in Maryland, in the district, but also out in Virginia on the heights on the other side of the Potomac River. And so Barton is going to become, she's going to gather supplies for originally Massachusetts soldiers, but she's going to very quickly transition to help all Union soldiers, gathering supplies for them and then going out to the camps. And people are going to start to send her goods, send her things. And so by the time Barton is coming into the summer of 1861, even before the Battle of Bull Run, she has a full-fledged relief operation going, just herself. A one-woman, we call her a one-woman NGO. She's all on her own, gathering supplies, people sending from all over the North. She has connections in New Jersey and Philadelphia, New York, Massachusetts. People are sending her goods and she's distributing them to soldiers. So she actually needs to expand her apartment, her boarding house space. So she lived elsewhere in DC until May or June of 1861. It's unclear exactly when she moves, but she moves into about 2 blocks from the patent office on 7th Street. The building that she is occupying is at the intersection of 7th and E Street. This photograph, some of you may have seen this before. It is taken of Alexander Gardner's studio. That is in the right at the center of the photograph in 1864. But this photograph actually shows the boarding house where Barton lived. So if you look, I think you all can see my mouse. If you look over here, you're going to see a building with a little bit of an awning sticking out. That is going to be the building that Barton is going to occupy. That 3rd floor of that building is a boarding house that is operated by Mr. Edward Shaw. It is in a building that is owned by a woman named Susan Ireland. I believe Paula Whitaker, I saw her earlier somewhere in the listening out there right now. She's done amazing work on Susan Ireland, the owner of the building, on her blog, as well as for the museum. So if you go to civilwarmed.org and search Susan Ireland, you'll find an article all about the history of this building. It is a fascinating history. So Barton is going to move into, let's see if I can find the mouse again. Here we go. Into the room way up here on the most northern side of the building on the 3rd floor. She has 2 windows overlooking 7th Street. She gets some decent afternoon light. She complains because it's pretty cold there in the morning because the building does face west. But she occupies that space so she has room for all of the supplies that she is gathering. And so this becomes her new work. She's going to continue working at the patent office, but her calling, she can't suit up and join the Union Army as a woman. She is going to provide relief. She is going to eventually become a nurse. She is going to fill in where society allows her to, and that is to perform these relief efforts to support her boys, as she calls them. They're her boys, these soldiers in Union blue that she wants to support. And that support is going to, again, as I mentioned already, first be classified as relief work, gathering supplies, distributing to soldiers. That work grows so much so that she fills her boarding house room. And she needs warehouses elsewhere. By 1862, Clara Barton has so many supplies that she has 3 separate warehouses in Washington that she is renting. She is stashing away supplies there to take out to the battlefield. Now, Clara Barton, in the summer of 1862, is trying to get out onto the battlefield. The army is refusing to allow her access, saying the battlefield is no place for a woman. But it's not until the situation gets pretty desperate in the summer of 62 that the quartermaster department kind of relents and allows her to go. So Barton's first battlefield experience, and she's not on the battlefield when the battle's happening, but she sees the aftermath of Cedar Mountain outside of Culpeper. She sees the aftermath and kind of the retreat away from Second Bull Run. She's very close to the battlefield at Fairfax Station. Is going to do some nursing in Fairfax Station. In the kind of adjacent, she's out there in the thunderstorm during the Battle of Chantilly on September 1st, 1862, and then ultimately comes back into the city of Washington after the Bull Run campaign. And as Lee is entering into Maryland and invading Maryland, Barton is regrouping at her boarding house on 7th Street. She's gathering up the supplies from her warehouses and is able, as the Army of the Potomac begins its pursuit of Lee, she is able to get her hands on 3 Army wagons and the teams that went with them, the drivers. And she is able to fill those wagons with her supplies, including medical supplies, and heads off into Maryland, gets into the Army. I always joke about 270, the traffic being terrible. It's not bad these days, but the experience for Clara Barton in 1862 on her way to Antietam is similar to what traffic is typically like in Maryland heading out towards Frederick. It is slow. It takes her a long time to get anywhere near the front lines. She gets there, though. September 17th, 1862, she is on the battlefield for the Battle of Antietam. So this is going to be her first trial by fire. She is in close proximity to the cornfield area of the battlefield. She is going to be in a hospital, one of the 3 Poffenberger farms, and she is going to occupy. It is being used as a First Corps field hospital. She's going to volunteer her services and her supplies there. Situation so desperate on the morning of the 17th that a bullet ripped through the sleeve of her dress as she's working in the yard of the hospital tending wounded soldiers, kills a man she was giving a drink of water to. Her supplies were desperately needed. They were running out of everything. First Corps had been in severe action for, at South Mountain, going back to the Bull Run campaign as well. And so those supplies were running really low, and Barton's 3 wagons are going to essentially keep that hospital operating. She works there for 72 hours or so until her supplies are exhausted, till she's exhausted. She heads back to DC. She is going to be gain renown, though. She's going to be written about for her efforts at Antietam. A surgeon named James Dunn served with a Pennsylvania regiment, was at that hospital, the Poffenberger Hospital. And he, in a letter home to his wife, called Clara Barton the true heroine of the age, the angel of the battlefield. And that letter got published in northern newspapers, went out to the Associated Press, and Barton became pretty famous. She becomes the angel of the battlefield. That's what she becomes known during the war. And significantly for what happens later, Antietam is going to be where Barton starts to note in her diary soldiers she's looking for. So as she becomes a public figure and people recognize that she's going to the battlefield, family members of those who have gone missing, who disappeared during these battles, were killed, oftentimes buried in unknown graves. Barton is going to receive letters from their families saying, hey, I know you were at Antietam. Did you see my husband? Did you see my son? Did you see my brother? And she's going to start to write these names down in her diary. And so that you can think of the Missing Soldiers Office work as what's going to come after the war is already beginning to crystallize in her mind as the war is ongoing, that all of these families are suffering and grieving. So Barton's first battlefield experience is going to come at Antietam. She's going to become very familiar with the battlefields of the Civil War. She's going to become a familiar figure for some Army units out in the field, be they from Massachusetts or otherwise. She's going to be on the field for Fredericksburg. She's going to head down to South Carolina in 1863. She's actually in the vicinity of the battlefield. Fort Wagner with the 54th Massachusetts is going to make their assault in July of 1863. She tends to a smallpox epidemic among freed people in South Carolina and coastal Carolina as well. But by 1864, she's back in DC, and in the spring of 1864 is going to respond famously to the Overland Campaign. So this is where this photograph comes from Fredericksburg in 1864, after the battles of the Wilderness and Spotsylvania Courthouse. Clara Barton is one of the early relief workers, nurses who are going to arrive at Fredericksburg, as there's between 10 and 20,000 wounded who arrive in that city in the span of about 2 weeks. Barton is involved in that effort. She's going to follow the army down to Petersburg, where she is going to make contact with another kind of figure from Massachusetts that's going to be important in her life and career. That's Benjamin Butler with the Army of the James. Massachusetts man, and they're going to become pretty close. They're going to become friends, and he is going to open doors for her, including she is going to help to manage a hospital at Petersburg for quite a bit of time in 1864. 1,000 beds. She's going to be helping to manage that with the U.S. Army. So her kind of street cred has grown significantly as the war has gone on, and her connections are continuing to grow as the war goes on. So by the end of 1864, though, U.S. Army really begins to have things in hand medically. They have less and less use for kind of a single operator. Barton never works with the Sanitary Commission or the Christian Commission. She was always kind of on her own and independent. She liked that flexibility. She also liked not having anyone who was kind of a tyrant over her, an authority figure. She kind of made her own rules. That didn't always make her popular, especially among some Army officers who took a lesser, dimmer view of fierce, independent women. There's actually one doctor at the Battle of Fredericksburg, where Barton was at, who said that after experiencing Clara Barton running the cookhouse at the Lacey House Hospital, modern-day Chatham at Fredericksburg, he said he would never let a woman ever run a cookhouse in his hospital ever again as a result of Clara Barton. So she left a strong impression, sometimes for good, but oftentimes, especially in this 19th century Victorian world in which men were really dominant and women were supposed to have a place, Clara Barton often left that place. She's oftentimes on the very cutting edge of kind of social norms. And so that's going to make her into kind of this, either a very popular figure or one who is worthy of scorn, some men would believe. But as the war is coming to an end, Barton kind of finds a new mission. She is a woman she's a person who has a lot of kind of mental struggles, struggles with depression. She actually is diagnosed with melancholia in the 1870s. Mental illness runs in her family. There's been lots of speculation as to what she had, whether it was just depression or whether she was bipolar, because she had these really high and low moments during many points in her life. But in this age before medication, it seems like the way that Clara Barton dealt with some of these mental health struggles that she had was by keeping busy and kind of keeping her, the pedal to the metal, so to speak, and keeping busy and focusing on her work, and especially the humanitarian work. And so by 1864 and 1865, with the war drawing to a close, she's running out of things to do and her mental health starts to really decline. But she ends up at this camp here that you see, Camp Parole near Annapolis. And she is there as some of the, as you see on the left, I'm sure an image you're all familiar with, as men from Andersonville and Florence, South Carolina, and some of the other southern prison camps are being brought back into Union lines to Camp Parole. And she is setting up an office there to kind of provide aid and assistance to them. But very quickly, that office in early 1865 kind of changes in its mission. She's not just for providing relief for these soldiers and comfort. She is hearing stories of the horrors of Andersonville. And she understands, again, from her wartime experience receiving correspondence from families looking for loved ones, that she's hearing that as many as 13,000 men died at Andersonville. And so she knows that that's 13,000 soldiers whose families have no idea what happened to them. And so Barton is going to launch a new endeavor. In the early months of 1865, she's going to launch a missing soldiers office. She's going to get approval from Abraham Lincoln. She does not ever meet Lincoln in person. She tries on a handful of occasions. She's always turned away. The president's too busy. But she relies on her connections within the U.S. Army, connections with Benjamin Butler, connections with Henry Wilson as well. And she is able to get her proposal to Abraham Lincoln, and in March of 1865, he is going to sign off on Barton running this office, which is going to start being managed out of a tent at Camp Parole, and is going to then transition back to her boarding house room on 7th Street in Washington, which for months at a time would be left empty. And when she is off on campaign, you might be wondering how she was able to manage to keep her job at the patent office, which she did for most of the war, still able to get a paycheck, which is the only money that's coming in other than donations from people. Edward Shaw helped do some of her work, would bring home her work while she was out in campaign, and do her work to make sure that she could still get a paycheck. She was not wealthy, not independently wealthy, so she got a lot of help. But by the end of the Civil War, the patent office is getting close to cutting her off. And in the end, they actually do. They say, we're not going to pay you anymore. You're off the rolls. You're not working here anymore. But in 1865, Barton has this new mission. And that is going to be this missing soldiers office. She's going to set up shop in her boarding house room. She's back in Washington when Lincoln is assassinated. She's actually in the city the night of the assassination. I think one of the most moving entries in her diary comes from April 15th, 1865. She leads it off with, President died this morning, and then writes, no one knows what to do. So she has that moment of panic that the whole nation is really experiencing, this mourning. But it has a very direct impact on her. She has to now get approval from the new president. From Andrew Johnson. Andrew Johnson, he's pretty conservative, doesn't have a great opinion of these highfalutin women who are trying to do all of these man's jobs. And so she struggles to get kind of approval from him to continue on with this work. Interestingly enough, she gets some help from Ulysses Grant, writes a letter on her behalf in May of 1865 to say that he could see this work being pretty important, that it's not going to do any harm to have this work being done. So she's given kind of the go-ahead to continue on, but that's going to be a struggle for her because she doesn't have any money to do it. She learns that Congress is going to have to appropriate her funds. And so that kind of puts the missing soldiers office on ice. She is going to publish a list of names. She's going to compile and publish a list of names, because known as these rolls of missing men. But she is, she receives at one point as many as 300 letters in a single week. Shows her kind of the level of the need, and she simply, as a one-woman operation, cannot manage it. But she's going to start to make some connections at the end of the war that are going to be helpful. One of them is a guy named Dorrance Atwater. Dorrance Atwater was a survivor of Andersonville. He worked in the Confederate hospital there. With the Union prisoners. He recorded the deaths of everybody in that camp and smuggled out a list when he was transferred out of the prison. He and Barton are going to accompany a trip to Andersonville in August of 1865 to document the prison and the situation there for the war crimes trial of Henry Wirtz. She and Atwater are going to go and help to use that list that he had compiled to identify many of the dead at Andersonville. That list of names is ultimately going to get Atwater in a lot of trouble. That's a whole other presentation. He's going to end up in jail at the order of Edwin Stanton. He is ultimately going to be pardoned by Andrew Johnson. It's a whole story. But in the end, the list that Atwater compiled and smuggled out of Andersonville is published by Horace Greeley's Tribune Press up in New York. And Clara Barton writes a brief note and talks about the missing soldiers office in that pamphlet that was published with the list of names. And so that list of names and the notoriety that came with the publishing of that list of names partnered with, in February of 1866, she gets $15,000 from the federal government, from Congress, to fund the missing soldiers office, and she goes into the effort kind of full bore. Prints up a bunch of these signs and turns the entirety of her third floor. She originally only has one room. By 1866, she's occupying basically the entirety of the third floor. Is going to be used as a missing soldiers office. And she's going to have one large room on the front of the building that she is going to use as her office. This is a woodcut from Harper's Weekly showing Andersonville National Cemetery. This was published in, I believe, September of 1865. If you'll notice, the American flag is being flown over the cemetery grounds. You'll notice a woman raising that flag. That is Clara Barton. She is the one who raised the flag, the American flag, over the National Cemetery for the first time after it was cleaned up and organized and marked using Atwater's lists. So this is another of these kind of key points where Barton is getting her name out there. So Barton and her team, and she is able to hire a team of 10 plus clerks to work in this office. They're going to compile lists of names that are submitted by families of missing soldiers. These are only Union soldiers. She's only looking for Northern U.S. military personnel. No Confederates are going to be on any of these lists. As far as we can tell, she's not looking for any Confederate soldiers. I'll get to the correspondence in just a bit. But these lists of names, there's 5 of them published. 90,000 copies are going to go out to the Northern public. These lists of names are people that Barton is looking for and the office is looking for. And this little note over on the left, this is roll number 5, published in 1867. Essentially, this note signed by Barton says, if you recognize a name on this list and know what happened to the soldier, please write to the office and we will convey that information to the families to let them know what happened to their missing loved ones. In many cases, the names on this list are those who are killed, oftentimes killed in battle, or in some cases deserted and simply disappeared. I believe there's something around 6,000 names that appear on this list, on these lists that are published. And again, there's 5 of them that are published. This is actually a copy that we have on display at the Missing Soldiers Office. So if you want to see this artifact in person, we do have it at the museum. I think this is probably the most compelling artifact. You look at this list, I think there's something 500-600 names on this list. And these are the ones that Barton couldn't find. It's pretty tragic just to know that many of these men simply disappeared, vanished without a trace during the conflict. It really gives you an idea of just the scale of what this was like. And this is only a fraction of all of those who disappeared during the conflict. This is an image of what the office may have looked like. This is a modern kind of mock-up of what we believe the office may have looked like. There were no photographs taken of the office, no illustrations made. There are some kind of meager descriptions of what the office looked like. By all accounting, it was a pretty boring 19th century office. Not a lot to distinguish it from any other office in the city of Washington, with the exception of there was a small area, a closet, essentially, where Barton brought artifacts that she had collected at Andersonville, put them on display. So I always joke that it appears that the Missing Soldiers Office Museum is not the first museum on site at the Missing Soldiers Office, that Barton herself had her own little museum of relics that was later photographed by Alexander Gardner. That she displayed right in her office. So this is an image of Barton more images of Barton in 1865. This is right as she's beginning the Missing Soldiers Office work. So this is, again, Barton as she is doing these operations. She was exhausted by this work. It's not only trying to track down soldiers and what happened to them and going through correspondence and army records and flying all around the city with her clerks. She also was doing speaking tours. She's going out on speaking tours across the country to raise money and awareness for the Missing Soldiers Office, talking about what it was like to be a woman at the front lines. She was very, very busy and flying all over the place and getting her name out there. And she becomes a real public figure as a result of that. becomes I don't want to say a household name yet, but she's on her way there. She is one of the most prominent women in America at this time. She's also involved a little bit in the suffrage movement after the war as well. So she gets involved in some of the politics around Reconstruction, around women's rights as well. And those are going to be interests of hers for the rest of her days. And there are many days to come still for Barton. By the numbers here, so Barton operates the office until 1868. She closes down the office at the end of 1867, early 1868. She received 63,000 letters. It's about 100 letters a day. Came into the missing soldiers office from families looking for loved ones. And in the end, her and her team are able to find 22,000 missing Union soldiers. 13,000 of them come from Andersonville and are identified positively there. Some come from other prisons, and others information is going to be conveyed to families about, you know, what happened to their loved ones out on the battlefield, maybe a soldier who was there when they were killed in action and they ended up buried in an unknown grave. In other cases, many of those names on the list are never going to be found. So this was really unfinished work. If you want to access these rolls of missing men, we actually have a database on our website, CWRmed.org. It is searchable. So if you want to go and look, if you're interested in a particular unit, you can go and actually see whether or not, or a name, see whether or not they were put onto the missing soldiers rolls. As for the 63,000 letters, only about 20 of them survive in the Clara Barton collection at the Library of Congress. We don't know where the rest of them ended up. There are occasionally letters from the missing soldiers office that turn up in pension records. Turns out that Barton was a pretty reputable source for the Pension Bureau, and she and her team were able to help get some families the money that they had that was rightfully theirs as a result of the loss of a loved one during the war, and get them some pension money. And so occasionally, and this is really exciting, we have families come into the museum and bring along documents that are in their family collections that were documentation from the Missing Soldiers Office. And so we have a blog post on our website for the Missing Soldiers Office, ClaraBartonMuseum.org, that was written by one of these, by a woman who came to visit the office, and her ancestor died at Andersonville, and his widow actually went to the Missing Soldiers Office to find information about. And they have the full correspondence back and forth, which is really cool, but very, very rare, unfortunately. Barton, just to breeze through the rest of her life, this is her more commonly known story. She goes on to Europe after the Civil War era, learns about the Red Cross, gets involved in volunteering for the Red Cross during the Franco-Prussian War, comes back to the United States with the idea of getting an American chapter. It takes her a decade, but in 1882, she becomes the first president of the American chapter of the Red Cross. She changes the organization from being just a wartime relief organization into a civilian disaster response organization. She runs the American Red Cross until 1904, goes to all kinds of disasters, famous ones, Johnstown flood in Pennsylvania, Galveston, Texas hurricane in 1900, a couple of coastal hurricanes along the Gulf Coast and along the Carolina coast as well. She goes overseas as well, to the Ottoman Empire in the 1890s, to Cuba in 1898. She's in Havana when the USS Maine explodes in February of 1898. She got around, and by that time she was upwards in years, into her 70s and 80s, when she's doing some of that work. She is out of the Red Cross in 1904. The last years of her life are spent doing other humanitarian efforts, but she passes away at the age of 90 in April of 1912. Ironically, interestingly, the same week the Titanic sank. So just imagine, I always think of it as just like how much life she saw. Born on a small farm in Massachusetts in 1821, passes away the same week that the Titanic sinks. She saw all of these things in her life and really changed America and the world in her kind of image as a humanitarian. As for her office, she leaves in 1868. It goes on being a boarding house, as far as we can tell, until the 19-teens. The 19-teens, it is boarded up after, this third floor is boarded up after the Triangle Shirtwaist Fire in New York City, changes fire codes. The owners of the building make the decision to kind of board up the third floor, and it is left virtually untouched from about 1914 or 1915 until 1996. And so this is what it looked like when it was kind of rediscovered. The building was being prepared for sale and ultimate demolition by the General Services Administration, had ended up on the rolls of the federal government. That's a complicated story as well, but building is being prepared for demolition. It is in this condition: no running water, no electricity. That is when this gentleman comes in. This is Richard Lyons that Jon mentioned earlier. Richard's still around, does tours for us in every November around the anniversary of his rediscovery of the space. So rediscovery story is pretty crazy. So Richard, you can see him, this is a photo taken around that time, went into this abandoned building. You can see this, what this third floor looked like. It was completely dark. He goes up there with a flashlight. He's by himself, going through rooms. When he hears an incredibly loud bang from the front of the building, goes over to these windows that you can see him looking out of, and looks down, sees there had been a car accident on the street. He's standing in about this approximate location. He feels a tap on his shoulder, turns around. There's no one there, but he happens to notice an envelope hanging out near the ceiling on the wall that is just behind the photographer here taking the picture. And he sees this hole in the ceiling, and there's a letter sticking out between the wall boards just below the hole. And so he gets a ladder, he climbs up there, takes down the envelope. Turns out it was addressed to Edward Shaw, the Civil War era landlord. But then Richard does something that I would never do, ever. I guess he was just jaded as being he was a carpenter in DC doing this kind of work for a long time, but he sticks his hand into this hole in the ceiling, feels a piece of roots around, feels a piece of metal, and pulls it down. It was the missing soldier's office sign. And he recognized the name. Didn't know anything about the missing soldier's office, but recognized the name Miss Clara Barton. He puts his head into this hole, had a ladder there. He climbed up and he looked into this hole and saw what turned out to be about 1,000 artifacts from the mid-19th century, including many that had connections to Clara Barton in the Civil War. Some clothing, some correspondence to Edward Shaw, some photographs, as well as several hundred pairs of socks. Some of them had blood on, were soldier socks from the war that appeared to have there, and which had never been mended or repaired and were just left in the ceiling and stored there.
We're having some difficulty. I don't know why. By hearing you. Keep talking, Jake.
Can't hear.
Can't hear Jake. Repeat, Jake.
For you.
It may be on his end. He might have to reboot.
It appears to be a bandwidth issue, Jake. Maybe if we go without the audio or without the visual.
Is anybody else having any trouble, or only with Jake?
Yes, Kurt.
Yes. Can't hear him.
It was fine until just the last remarks.
Right. Since we're able to speak, I think it may just be a situation with his connection.
Yeah, it was fine. You just mentioned.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry.
We lost you when he found the sign.
Okay. So, and it's, okay, when we found the sign. Okay. So, in the end, as a result, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. You can hear me. Okay.
Yes.
He, ultimately, the discovery, of a bunch of artifacts in that attic, he was able to convince enough people in the GSA that they ultimately made the decision not to tear down the building. In the end, it is going to, the building is going to be preserved. They're going to, the GSA makes the decision to preserve the space and ultimately helps a museum there. And they partnered in 2012 with my institution, with the National Museum of Civil War Medicine. And in 2015, the Clara Barton Missing Soldiers Office Museum opened. GSA was very generous, did a full renovation of the space back to its 19th century appearance. And that is the museum. At the end of this pandemic, if you get a chance to come and visit, you're going to see space where Clara Barton lived and worked. You're going to see it very in the same way that Barton would have experienced it. The space is really dedicated to Barton's work. So this is where Barton went from being a average everyday American, a teacher, a government clerk, to becoming a humanitarian known around the world, and still providing inspiration today. I'm sure many of you are probably familiar with Jose Andres and the Jaleo restaurant and his restaurants in Washington. Jose Andres lived and worked across the street at Jaleo when this discovery was made. As a result of this discovery being made and ends up on the front page of the Washington, or on the local section of the Washington Post, Jose Andres became interested in the story of Barton, and it helped to provide some inspiration for him to start World Central Kitchen, which he's doing amazing work around the world, but also here in the US. And he directly attributes Clara Barton to helping him find his own humanitarian voice. So that's a pretty awesome connection to the modern day that comes out of this space being saved and ultimately being restored. But I want to thank you all so much for being here and for letting me share this story with you all tonight. I'm sorry for those technical difficulties and for my unstable internet connection. But I hope you enjoyed the presentation, and I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have. Thank you so much.
Jake, it's Bill Benzel. And
Thank you.
first of all, that was excellent. Thank you so much for doing this. Could you expand a little bit on Clara Barton's efforts to meet Abraham Lincoln and why it was unsuccessful?
Yeah, so I want to say it's February, maybe late January, February of 1865. She has the idea of the Missing Soldiers Office. And she goes to the White House, I believe, on 2 occasions with the intention of seeing the president. She does have these political connections, so she is kind of able to get in the door and to where she can kind of, she's kind of in line to see President Lincoln. But it just so happens that when she is there, there are kind of more pressing matters that are being discussed. And one particularly rainy day, she was there and ultimately was turned away. She was at the White House for hours, was turned away and was really depressed. But she was unsuccessful in meeting Lincoln. She did, there's a wonderful letter in the collection at the Library of Congress where she wrote in probably the most extravagant, I don't have a picture here, unfortunately, the most extravagant opening to a letter you could ever imagine. But it's written, it takes up almost half the page of like, hello, and, Mr. Lincoln, President Lincoln, where she's trying to get his attention. But ultimately she is successful at kind of getting the attention of the president because of the political connections that she had made. And so he gives her written approval to start the Missing Soldiers Office efforts, and that approval ultimately ends up being shared with newspapers across the North, and over Lincoln, his signature in newspapers, his name. There's essentially a press release that says, if you're missing a loved one, please contact Clara Barton in Washington, D.C. And that really helped to kickstart the efforts. That's when the hundreds of letters started coming in.
She also did attend Lincoln's inaugural ball, the second inaugural ball, which was ironically at the patent office. She saw him, but she didn't meet him at the ball.
Yeah, she has these kind of moments throughout the war where she kind of crosses paths with a lot of notables, and some there's a deeper connection, like again, like Grant writing a letter in her behalf. But I think it's really interesting. You have Walt Whitman conversation coming up. We oftentimes get asked, because Barton and Whitman were at the same hospital at Fredericksburg, at Chatham Manor, but we have no record from either of them that they met each other. Chances are they saw each other, they crossed paths, but they never, wrote about, I saw Walt or I saw Clara Barton at the hospital. So that happens a bit in Barton's life during the Civil War.
Hey, Jake, thank you very much for doing this. I happened to notice that the bandwidth cut out right when you were talking about the bloody socks.
Okay.
Were those preserved? Did she have any sense that maybe that was evidence or some sort of way to determine if there were soldiers that she couldn't identify but had their socks?
No, unfortunately. So there's a lot of that's not clear about, what was preserved in this attic space. What it seems like is that the landlord was kind of a hoarder. Edward Shaw kind of kept all manner of things, a lot of trash, a lot of junk in this kind of storage space above the ceiling on the third floor. From what we can tell, what was saved there was what was left behind when Barton moved out in 1867 and 1868. It's simply what she left behind, and Shaw didn't throw it away. Chances are those socks probably ended up there before, maybe at the end of the war, where they didn't have a use anymore and they ended up in that attic space. We don't really fully know whether or not, that's what Barton was doing, whether she was helping to repair socks. It seems logical, but there are other boarders living in this space. One of them is, I always forget his name. Last name is Taft. He has a diary at the Library of Congress. He actually lived in one of these other boarding house rooms, one of the other boarding house rooms on the third floor in 1864 and early 1865. But we don't know a lot about the other tenants. We don't know a lot about what ended up in the attic and why it ended up in the attic. Unfortunately, I wish we knew more, but there's not a lot of documentation on that.
One thing they told us when I was doing this about the socks, apparently there are a couple hundred pairs of these, that the reason there's still blood on them is in order to repair, you have to repair the socks before you wash them, because otherwise they'll fall apart. So apparently she just didn't get around to repairing them, therefore they still had blood on them. And there are so many, they probably did belong to soldiers. Yeah,
and they are, when you look at them, a lot of them are actually uniform, it's interesting that, and some of them are actually in pretty good shape, but the ones with blood on them are really remarkable.
They found things like a bayonet in there and a sanitary commission shelter tent, or at least half of one. And like Jake said, she actually didn't like the sanitary commission very much.
All right, me next.
Yes.
So, Jake, thanks very much. That was very informative. Too bad we do not have Clara Barton today to be in charge of PPE for this pandemic. I mean, really, think of what she can do. Whoa, where is she? We need her more than ever. But first I want to put in a plug for you all joining the Civil War Medical Museum. I'm a member. My daughter is with me, and I'll tell you, great programs. And my daughter really was inspired to go into public history when we had the opportunity to go to the museum in Frederick for a members only viewing of the artifacts with gloves. And we were able to examine the artifacts, and it was so exciting. And she said, "Mom, this is what I want to do. This is what I want to do." And she went on to become an intern with them. But anyway, I do have a question. Mm-hmm. So she from what I heard, she really didn't have formal medical training in nursing or other medicine fields. So would you say her skills, because she was so good at what she did, was it logistics? Was it, you know, what skills did she bring that made her such a leader?
That's a really great question. And there's not really an easy answer to it. I contend that it is more of, it's kind of what the skills that Barton, you know, exhibited as a teacher, that she could be very kind and caring, but also could be a real advocate for herself and for those that she was in charge of. And so she felt early on in the war that the federal government was utterly mismanaging the war effort, that they weren't getting enough food to soldiers, that they weren't getting them the best medical supplies, that they weren't giving them prompt medical attention. This is actually why she goes to the battlefield in the first place, is because by the time she's seeing them in the hospitals in Washington, the men are on their deathbed. Their condition is so poor, and the hospitals that existed in the early, you know, months of the war were not designed to be hospitals. They're the patent office and the Capitol building, these already pre-existing government edifices that are changed into hospitals. So Barton feels that the soldiers were really getting poor treatment, and she wanted to do what she could to help them. And what she found is that she couldn't do much for them in DC because they were already in such a foregone conclusion when they arrived on the city docks. She actually remarks about this. You know, as they're being brought up 7th Street to the hospitals, these soldiers are already in terrible condition. So she wants to go to the battlefield to do something for them. Where her nursing experience kind of comes in, I think it's she was passionate and she cared, and she looked at these men again as her boys. And you hear this a lot from nurses in the war, and today. Shout out to all the amazing nurses who are doing incredible work right now. You know, they become these huge advocates for their patients, and so that tender care, which is, you know, I don't want to throw all the Army surgeons under the bus from the Civil War, but they have so many patients that they're caring for, and it's a numbers game. They, you know, are much more about trying to get men through the system and get them back to Army hospitals or back out to the front lines if they're well enough. Barton cares about the individual. And I think that really is what helps to make her a great nurse, helps to make other women, and in some cases men too, be great nurses during the war.
Thank you.
Jake, I have a question. Jake, I'm George Deitch from the Erie, Pennsylvania. Used to be a member of the roundtables in the area and the Lincoln group, so I enjoy seeing a couple of familiar faces. You mentioned that as far as you know, no Confederate soldiers were in her search parameters. Do you have any idea why?
Well, as she's starting the office, she is a partisan in this conflict. She does care for Confederate soldiers in her wartime experience. Fredericksburg's one example that she writes a bit about caring for Confederate soldiers who are in the care of Union military personnel, Union medical personnel. But as she's starting this effort, the war is still ongoing. The war is still ongoing. There's still active hostilities. She is focused on men who served with the U.S. Army, the U.S. Navy, and served in that capacity. She does not write a lot about feeling those feelings towards Confederates. She feels very adversarial, and that is something that doesn't fully ever go away. Later on, she does get into more of the kind of reconciliationist narrative. We start getting into the 1880s and the 1890s. But she, in many of her suffrage speeches, actually kind of waved the bloody shirt, so to speak, to try to get Northern veterans to support supporting women's suffrage. And so she used her experience as an Army nurse during the war and with the Missing Soldiers Office to try to convince that northern veteran voting bloc to support women's suffrage. But yeah, she, as far as I know, in her correspondence and what she wrote around the wartime era, she mentions Confederates almost no times. She's not interested.
But yet she goes to Galveston for the disaster relief there, and you said some Gulf Coast and Carolina coast. So she can't have total animosity for the Southern people.
Right, and it does lessen as the years go by. She does, again, as the war goes on, especially around, you imagine around the 1890s, she is getting involved around the Spanish-American War. She's going to be involved with the American Red Cross and getting involved with the war effort. And that war itself, I mean, there's people that talk during that conflict that talk about this being a great opportunity to bring the country together, to take on a foreign foe, a foreign empire. Very famously, I think is it Joseph Wheeler, who is going to a Confederate cavalry commander during the Civil War, is going to put on the American uniform and go back to serve the U.S. Army, and this is this great moment where everybody's coming back together. Of course, that's a very simple narrative, but it was one that that you can see, as I mentioned, Clara Barton does start to soften her tone as the years go by, and so it makes sense that she really if someone was in need and someone was in dire straits, she didn't care about where they were from. She didn't really care about who they were. She's going to try to help them. It just so happens that, during the wartime era, she wasn't focused on the Confederate side. And there was no equal effort on the Confederate part. I mean, one of the questions I oftentimes get asked doing these things, was there a missing soldiers office for Confederate soldiers? And there wasn't. The only thing that's close to that effort is on behalf of women in Virginia and North Carolina who are going to go to Gettysburg, northern battlefields, and repatriate bodies, bring them back to like Hollywood Cemetery in Richmond. That's the only effort. There was no centralized effort to try to recover war dead. And Clara Barton's efforts here in the war are really cutting edge. This is the first time anything like this had ever been attempted in the aftermath of a conflict. And it helps to provide inspiration for kind of the idea behind graves registration in the 1890s in the Spanish-American War, and then especially when you get to World War I, where graves registration and properly caring for American war dead becomes a priority. Oftentimes because, looking back at the Civil War, there was no efforts whatsoever, or very little efforts put into identifying the dead, giving them proper burials, and so that was a wrong that by the 20th century, the U.S. Army had a vested interest in getting right.
Thank you.
I have a question.
Jake, I got a couple. Go ahead. So whoever had a question, go ahead. I'll ask later.
I just wanted to ask, I understand that she met Susie King Taylor, a famous African-American nurse at Edisto, or Edisto, I don't know how to say the name.
Yeah, I don't know either. I think, is it Edisto? Anybody know? Down in South Carolina?
Edisto.
Edisto, okay. Thank you.
Welcome.
And so I guess she was sort of in contact with other types of like field nurses, but I do think, I just want to say I have visited the Civil War Medicine Museum in Frederick, and there was a nurse's cap there that I saw how it was sewn with the muslin and the lace, and I sewed my own to for my daughter, because she portrayed Clara Barton in the 4th grade wax museum.
Yeah.
Cool.
Good job.
We had Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson, so we needed to have my other daughter portrayed as Grant. But
Jake,
yeah.
one of the interesting connections is that both Clara Barton and Harriet Tubman served wounded soldiers in Fort Wagner in South Carolina, but as far as we know, their paths never crossed.
Yeah, this is another one of those. They're in the same place at the same time, and it doesn't get mentioned.
Doesn't get mentioned. Yeah.
Yeah, it doesn't get mentioned. But Barton was, and this you may have noticed. I made a brief mention of this, that Barton doesn't consider herself an abolitionist until 1863. It's her wartime experience in South Carolina with freed slaves, and freed people who went into Union lines, that makes her into an abolitionist, and she becomes a huge advocate for freed people at the end of the Civil War and in the years afterwards. In fact, this goes against the suffrage amendment. Not suffrage amendment. She becomes kind of a rival to the suffrage movement, to many in the suffrage movement, because she supports the 15th Amendment. She supports giving Black men the right to vote before white women, and this made her pretty unpopular. But it was her experiences in South Carolina during the war where she said, you know, who am I to let this man, this old man who has been enslaved all his life with whip marks on his back, the door is open for him to get these rights that could save his life and save his people. Who am I to pull him back and go through that door first? It's actually one of the more moving kind of letters in the collections related to Barton, because it's very powerful language. But that position did not make her popular with some of her other white, suffrage advocates, because she was advocating giving Black men the right to vote before white women. But this is going to be a position that she kind of has for the rest of her life, that she believes that especially all of these Black men who served in the U.S. Army had earned those rights just as much as she as a nurse and as a white woman had earned those rights. What they didn't realize is that window at the early 1870s was closing very quickly on Reconstruction. She believed that, Black men are going to get the right to vote, and then there's going to be another amendment, and they're going to get women the right to vote. Of course, that never happened.
Jake, I'm an old Red Cross herd, worked on Katrina, et cetera, and I know that Clara Barton in Galveston also worked a very non-segregated way of helping the Blacks in African Americans in Galveston, for example. Also, I also wanted to ask about her meeting with Henri Dunant. What's your understanding about that? Who started the International Red Cross movement?
Yeah, so this is one of those there are a couple of these moments with Barton where things fall in just the right way, that allows, sorry, I have sirens going outside.
Well, mute yourself. No, just kidding.
I already did that earlier. We don't need to do that again. But the Red Cross connection is one of those, just these moments where it's like everything falls into place in just the right way. You know, how does Barton end up in Switzerland at all? You know, it's a really roundabout way, which is fascinating. So she had a connection from her Civil War experience down in Petersburg. She is nursing this soldier who is a Swiss immigrant, and they become friends as she's nursing him back to health. When she opens the missing soldiers office, he ends up coming to work in her office. And when she needs a break, at the end of her missing soldiers office period, she's at the end of her rope physically, mentally, emotionally. She needs a place to go. She needs to get away. He offers her a place to go stay with his family in Switzerland near Geneva. And she goes. And when she gets there, they publish the names of arrivals, and they let people, where visitors are coming from. And here comes Clara Barton, the angel of the battlefield of the American Civil War, into Geneva. And representatives from the International Committee of the Red Cross are going to meet Barton. They're going to get to know her. She's going to get to know them. They squire each other about Switzerland. And then when the Franco-Prussian War breaks out, Barton goes and volunteers with them and sees them in action. And that is that, they have this kind of, this perfect moment, this meeting up that is going to inspire all of this change right down to our own time period. And it almost didn't happen.
Wow.
Well, the guy that Jake is talking about, now the reason his parents are in Geneva is Jules Goulet, and his father is a justice on the Swiss Supreme Court.
Wow.
Yeah, there's some
Go stay with my parents when you go to Europe.
yeah, it's those connections, you know. That's one of the things. I think it's a really powerful way. We did this for the museum. We did these museum member publications called the Surgeon's Call. If you become a member, you get access to this. We did the series of issues called Clara Barton's Network. And it was all of these people that Barton had met and interacted with, became friends with, in some cases kind of became enemies with. But it's all these people that she was connected with. And she built this really impressive social network that gave her access to people in high places, people that helped to open doors for her, whether it be on Capitol Hill with Senator Henry Wilson, or in the U.S. Army with Benjamin Butler, or kind of tangentially to Abraham Lincoln at the White House. And those relationships are going to go on for the rest of her life. She's going to get connected with Frederick Douglass. She's out on the speaking tour in the 1860s with Frederick Douglass. They cross paths. They correspond a couple of times through the 19th century. You know, she has these connections with these other people that are going to provide all of these opportunities. And you could do a whole history of Barton just through the people she met and the relationships she built. Because as is true today, whether you're in the humanitarian field or like me, the museum field, relationships are everything. And Clara Barton understood that.
Jake, if I could ask, with respect to work at Andersonville, do you know whether she interviewed any returned soldiers? If she ultimately provided any testimony that was used in the Wirtz trial?
No, she doesn't have testimony that's used in the Wirtz trial, but what she does testify about later, and she becomes, I believe, if not the first woman to testify before Congress, one of the first, and that is in one of these kind of reviews of the war. I'm not sure if the Committee on the Conduct of the War was still around when she testified or not, but she becomes one of the first women to testify before Congress, and she talks about what she saw at Andersonville, and that she kind of attests to the horrors that she witnessed. Now, she didn't witness them firsthand, and this gets where she's talking with, and this goes towards her kind of, she didn't discriminate. You know, she's talking to slaves who were in the vicinity of Andersonville, and after the war is over, they've been freed, and they are talking about the prison and where everything was. They showed them around. You know, she's kind of interviewing them and talking to them about what they saw and what they experienced during the war. And then she's relaying it to Congress. So she did have that, you know, she has that connection. And as for I don't believe she has any direct connection with kind of the trial of Wirtz, but she talks about it afterwards.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Anything else? Questions?
I have one more.
Go ahead, Debbie.
Well, there's a lot of things that were sort of coming together in the Civil War, and I think one of them was that there was a number of women, especially from Massachusetts, who were trained by Florence Nightingale. So you have Jane Stuart Woolsey at Theological Seminary. You have the system, and you have these elements in the Civil War that sort of point to the future, like in warfare, medicine, nursing, you know, and like I see with Andersonville, that to me, it was like a concentration camp, you know, that we'd see, and then the trench warfare of World War I, and then the nursing, the Red Cross being formed. I mean, it just seems like the Civil War brought these types of things out in our society and culture.
Absolutely. I think it's a really good point. And I do want to say, you brought up Florence Nightingale, so I'm going to say happy 200th birthday to Florence Nightingale. This is her 200th birthday today, International Nurses Day. But I think you brought up some really important points. The Civil War is just this immense turning point in so many ways. Now, there's people that call it the first modern war. I disagree. I think this is very much still firmly rooted in the 19th century. And you're seeing the beginnings of things that are going to come out in modern war in the 20th century. Like you mentioned, trench warfare. Some of these prison camps are pretty hellacious, conditions pretty bad. I will say, you know, Andersonville, by far, hands down, the worst. Florence, South Carolina, close behind. But those northern prison camps were no picnics either. Do want to throw that out there. But I think that's a really good point that you mentioned, that all of these things are going to be these lessons that are going to be learned during the Civil War that are going to be applied to future conflicts, whether that's from medicine to battlefield tactics to humanitarian response. The lessons learned out of the Civil War are going to have a longer term consequences right up to the present day. It might be 155, 160 years later, but there's still so many lessons that we can take away from the Civil War, in terms of logistics, in terms of strategic thought, in terms of all of these different things, problem solving. How did they deal with these problems that they were all experiencing? But we can look back to the Civil War and we can get some lessons from that. Now, I do have, go ahead, Eileen.
Quick question. Did she end up with a federal pension for all of this valuable work, or just from the patent office, or anything?
Yeah, no, I don't believe she ever ended up with a pension. She was kind of, I don't want to say wealthy, but she's comfortable. She's comfortable with the Red Cross. She's getting, she's being sustained by those efforts for the remainder of her days. She's never really, wealthy. I think she gets better off than she had been in her life before as an independent woman. But she never has to kind of rely on a pension or anything like that as she got older, because she had kind of those connections. This actually relates to a question. I do have two questions here from the chat. One of them is kind of related to this, and that is from Mike Burns. Says, when did the Glen Echo location come into the picture?
Thank you.
That's a really good question. That comes about in the 1890s. So Clara Barton was looking for a location. They were looking for a location for Red Cross headquarters somewhere in Washington. And they were working in the early 1890s on developing a community, a planned community on the outskirts of Washington that became Glen Echo. And it was built on this model, which I find fascinating, on the Chautauqua model, which was this idea that, we bring everybody, Americans, together around these kind of core ideas that we're going to talk about civics, and we're going to talk about religion, and we're going to bring all of these people together in a park. We're going to have all of these important Americans living here. And so they looked for celebrities that they could bring in to attract people to Glen Echo. And they ended up with Clara Barton and the Red Cross. And so this planned community, and I can't remember the gentleman who built it, but they built the house at Glen Echo for Clara Barton. They didn't pay anything. The Red Cross basically ended up with a free headquarters. And the downside to that is it became Clara Barton's house and Red Cross headquarters. And in 1904, those, Clara Barton and the Red Cross parted ways, and not in a happy way. Clara Barton ended up with the house, and the Red Cross went elsewhere in Washington. That's a whole other story. But there is still kind of a vestige connections to this today. If you've tried to go and visit the national park site for Clara Barton at Glen Echo, it was closed for many years. What they found was that, it was built super cheap, because they weren't getting, they were building it for free. And there's lots of structural issues when they went to do some renovations, which ended up being many millions of dollars, which the National Park Service doesn't necessarily have. So they're really struggling out there as a result. And that dates back, it's a problem that dates back to the 1890s.
That was as cheap as I could see anybody building anything, because they just attached muslin to the studs in order to make walls.
Yeah,
I don't think you can get cheaper than that.
Yeah, and it's like, when all of the supplies that Barton was stashing in the building were helping to hold the building up, that it is built pretty cheaply. I have another question here from a couple questions here from the chat. Thank you for adding these. One of them, go back to the early one from Peggy. Is it possible to come back to speak about Clara Barton and Dorrance Atwater in the list? Yeah, I can touch on that a little bit. So Dorrance Atwater was a soldier from New York, I want to say. Is he from, John, do you know this? Is he from New York?
He was from Terrytown, Connecticut.
Maryville,
Connecticut. Okay, it's Connecticut. Thank you.
Connecticut.
Thank
He
you.
was in a New York cavalry regiment.
Okay, he's in a New York cavalry regiment. Great, thank you.
After that,
So
Bell Gettysburg.
so he gets captured, ends up first at Belle Isle in Richmond, ends up volunteering as to work as a clerk with the Confederate overseer camp, ends up then at Andersonville and is working in the hospital keeping track of death records. He smuggles that list out, ends up giving it to the War Department when he ends up at Camp Parole, learns about Clara Barton, also is going to generate a second copy of his list, which is where things are going to get real messy when it comes to the War Department, which claimed ownership over the list. The Confederate list, that the original copy disappeared forever. It's thankful that Dorrance Atwater kept this. Other prisons don't have that that record. Those records disappeared. You go to Florence, South Carolina today. Most of the dead Union soldiers in that prison cemetery are unknown. But Atwater had that list. He gets connected with Barton, and together they kind of provide a front together where they become advocates for all of those for those soldiers and for their families. And that's going to get Atwater in hot water with the War Department. They're going to dishonorably discharge Atwater for trying to publish this list of names. And he's going to end up, like I said, in prison in New York. And ultimately, he is, he's going to be pardoned by Andrew Johnson. And essentially the next day, Barton and Atwater published the list with Horace Greeley in the Tribune. It's a pretty crazy story. There is a book out there about Atwater. I think it's I'm trying to, from Andersonville to Tahiti. He goes on to become married to a Tahitian princess, the minister to Tahiti. So he ends up living essentially in a tropical paradise, which is pretty crazy story. And then a question here from Susan, a quick explanation about why she parted ways with the Red Cross. The short version is that Barton was never good at managing funds. She was never good at managing her money personally or for organizations.
Nope.
And
Okay, so I'll listen in just a second.
Money ended up being missing. Sorry, can you all hear me?
You need to mute people.
Oh, Paul, you need to mute.
Okay, I think we're good. Okay, so she was never good at managing money, and by the early 1900s, 1902, 1903, 1904, the Red Cross wants to become a modern relief organization. Clara Barton, who is well into her 80s by that point, is kind of holding them back. And so with money missing, they kind of use that as an excuse to find new leadership. And so she's going to be forced out of the Red Cross. She's going to be very, very bitter until her dying days about that, because she viewed herself as the Red Cross. Clara Barton was the Red Cross in her mind. She responded personally to disasters. And what others in the Red Cross on the board for the organization, they wanted to modernize the organization, and Clara Barton was holding them back. And so ultimately they kind of found an excuse to get rid of her. And to move the organization in new directions. And that new direction is also ultimately where you get to World War I, which is going to help to generate what we know of as the Red Cross, with these connections to all of these communities all across the United States. That is going to be that kind of taking it away from the Clara Barton personally response to your disaster to more of this larger institution, this larger organization that has resources all around the country, and then can bring those resources together at disaster points where you need more.
We're losing Jake again.
Jake, you again.
Sort of thing.
Jake, maybe
We're having a problem with
trying to reconnect.
bandwidth.
you can, maybe Paula Whitaker can speak to Julia Wilbur's work. Did she work with Clara Barton while Jake's getting reestablished?
Here I am. They actually met. They met in like, the 1870s and 1880s. Julia Wilbur actually worked in the patent office well after Clara Barton, and she lived on 8th Street, so she lived nearby. And she talks a few times about going to visit Miss Barton. And then on another occasion, you know, another little chapter in Clara Barton's life is that as part of her, you know, need for R&R, she went to one of these rest cures, you know, which there were lots of them at the time, but a place, a sanitarium in Danville, New York, in upstate New York. And I think, Jake, maybe she even like bought a house there briefly.
Yeah, was it Danville?
Yeah, Danville, New York, right.
Yeah.
So she was up there, and in the meantime, Julia Wilbur, who, for those who don't know, was a relief agent in Alexandria and worked in the patent office. Julia had a niece who went up to Danville for health reasons, and she was trying to get information from the doctor about her niece's health. And she goes to Miss Barton. She goes to Clara Barton to see if Clara will kind of intercede with the doctor to get some information from her. So that's all in Julia Wilbur's diary. So they kind of crossed paths a few times as active single women in Washington, I guess.
And I just wanted to say, hi, Paula. It's great to see you.
Yeah, I just filled in while you were having technical difficulties.
I appreciate that. Thank you.
By the way, somebody asked Jake the question about a pension. Clara didn't get a pension, but Congress, I believe, voted $15,000 to her for the missing soldiers office after the fact. She'd spent more than that. I think she spent $17,500 on the office.
Yes, she outlays a lot of money that she gets from donations from speaking, and then ultimately she is able to recoup some of that money, which kind of helps her to keep body and soul together, which was a struggle for a lot of the Civil War time period, because she was so busy and so much throwing everything into her work that she didn't always think about, her basic household finances. So, well, I think I'm going to, before I lose you all again, because I know it's probably going to happen because it's saying the internet is unstable. I want to thank you all so much. It was great to see you all and great to talk with you. And yeah, if you consider becoming a member of the museum, that would help us out so much. And if you want to, you can tune in with us. We are on Facebook Live Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. So tomorrow at 1 o'clock, my colleague John Lustria will be talking to a former park ranger at Cedar Creek about medical care at the Battle of Cedar Creek. And then on Friday, I'm going to be doing an interview. Yeah, I'm going to be doing an interview with
name of the Facebook page.
And by the way, on our website, Steve Jaron has put together a compendium of various online resources, which includes Jake Wynn's museum. And so there will be a link if you go to our website where we have meetings and tours. So the post that is directly below Jake's will be where Steve Jaron has put together some materials.
Yeah, I actually did a Q&A with Jake and Dave Price a few weeks ago. I don't know if it's still on the website, where we talked about the similarities and differences between Civil War medicine and what's going on right now with the pandemic.
Yep,
I highly recommend it, and that link is on our website too.
Yep, and I just dropped the link for our Facebook page for Civil War Med into the chat as well. So if you want to go find it, you can find it in the chat. But I'm going to head out now. I want to thank you all so much. It was great to see you all, and I hope to see you at the museum soon.
CivilWarMed.org.
Yep.
CivilWarMed.org.
Bye, everybody.
Become a member.
Thanks, Jake.
Thanks, Jake. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Jake. Hey, Jake, one last thing, though. Oh, shoot, I missed him.
No, he's still here. Oh.
Okay, all right.
I can hear you.
Okay, we had to put a plug for the Washington. I think we beat the Phillies this year.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, it was. I experienced that personally. It hurt.
Okay.
Life will be better when baseball returns in
Indeed.
whatever form.
Amen.
Indeed. Indeed.
Korean baseball.
All right. Don't forget about Ron Kirkwood in June and Fergus Bordwick in July.
Good night, all.
Good night.
Good night, all.
Thank you.
Thanks for joining. Thanks for joining.
Stay on, Kurt. We'll do a quick debrief.
Okay.
Thanks,
sounds good.
Melanie. Melanie, get in touch with Jon Willen directly. She's got some good questions.
Yeah,
Okay.
okay.
I'll send you
Bye-bye.
that. Good night.
Thank you, everyone. A record group.
Yeah, that's what, 80 people?
91 was our max, but it went down to about 88 after we kicked a few out.
Right. And I was on there twice though. So,
Okay, 87. But
but
any
I think,
other debrief thoughts?
that went very well. The
gonna end the
technical
recording.
difficulties were on
I'm gonna end the
Jake's side.
recording.
Yeah, go ahead.
Right.